Welcome to Cedar Lane United Methodist Church and to the International Sunday School lesson for November 16th, 2025. I'm Rick Abbott, and today's lesson is from the book of Ezekiel. This Sunday's lesson materials focus on chapter 3 and chapter 24, but I'm going to take a broader perspective. In fact, I'm going to try something a little different today. I'm going to introduce our lesson on Ezekiel by reading you one of the Psalms. Some of you maybe remember our former pastor, Bill Mooney. Back in the 1970s, we had Sunday night services. And on one particular Sunday evening, he did a sermon on Psalm 137. I thought it was real appropriate for today. If this psalm had a title, it would probably be By the Rivers of Babylon. The psalm goes like this. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars, we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of those songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to the foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you've done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Psalm 137, verses 1 through 9, NIV. When Bill Mooney preached his sermon on this song all those years ago, he used to talk about the stages of grief, first outlined by the Swiss-American psychiatrist Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. You all are probably familiar with those stages of grief. First, there's denial, followed by anger, then bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. The writer of Psalm 137 was clearly bogged down in the early stages of grief. He cried, he said. He refused to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. He clung to his memories of Jerusalem the way it used to be. And most of all, he lashed out in anger at the people who blamed him, the people he blamed for his current situation. Of course, this is a normal reaction. But the psalmist needed to find a way to move beyond these stages of grief if he wanted to get along with it the rest of his life. And it wasn't just the psalmist who needed to do this. The whole nation of Judah had to find a way to move on to a better future when they lost everything they valued. As we learn in the book of Daniel, when the Babylonians took the people of Judah off into captivity, they tried to completely eliminate their culture. This was particularly true for the early exiles taken from the ruling classes, and Ezekiel was one of those, and so was Daniel. The Babylonians took away their freedom. They removed them from their homeland. They took away their language. They wouldn't let them speak their own language. They gave them new foreign names. They took away their names. They prevented them from eating their own familiar foods, and they even tried to take away their faith in God. It was a cultural catastrophe. What Babylon did to Israel was not unlike what our government did to some Native American peoples in the 1800s and to Southern slaves prior to the Civil War. We completely destroyed their way of life. So how do you overcome something like that? The answer is you have to let God help you adapt and grow, and that's where Ezekiel played a critical role. Ezekiel ministered to Jewish exiles living in Babylon when they faced a crisis of historic proportions. During Ezekiel's time, Judah was destroyed through a series of forced deportations. Our lesson materials tell us about 3 major deportations occurring in 605, 597, and 586 BC. In addition, a deportation took place in 582 BC. In a span of 20 to 25 years, the lives of the people of God were turned upside down. They needed to find a way forward, and the only one who could lead them was God himself. They needed to know where God was. The key question, where's God in all this? Was he back in Jerusalem? Was he dead? Had he abandoned his people? Were the Babylonians' gods stronger than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Had God been defeated? Where is God? Ezekiel was deported to Babylon in 597 BC, about a decade before the destruction of the temple. He was exiled with King Jehoiachin. Danny talked about him. He pronounced it too. Who remained in Judah for only 3 months before he surrendered to King Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel dates things a lot in his prophecies, and we can date all this. Ezekiel was 25 years old when he was deported. And I suspect he was probably already married to his wife, who in today's lesson, the Bible says, was the delight of his eyes. When all this happened to Ezekiel, he still had his wife. They had each other. But we read in today's lesson, she died 9 years after Ezekiel's exile. See Ezekiel chapter 24, verse 1. Ezekiel had lost his whole way of life, and he had lost the person he loved most in the world. No one listened to him. He was clearly not popular. But with God's help, he found a way forward. And one of the reasons he could do that was that he had experienced God in a personal and powerful way. 4 years earlier than his wife died, during the 5th year of Ezekiel's exile, he was sitting on the banks of the Kibar River. The Kibar River was a waterway near the Euphrates River in the Babylonian Empire. It was probably an artificial canal built by the Babylonians for irrigation and transportation. But in a way, I see one of the reasons I led with this psalm. Ezekiel was sitting by the rivers of Babylon, just like the psalmist had said. Ezekiel was 30 years old. And he was about to experience an event that would change his life. And it will not only change his life, it would change the life of all of us forever. Ezekiel was a priest descended from Zadok's lineage. These were high-level priests beginning in David's time. And they served the temple. Back then, Levites ended their training and started performing their full role as priests when they turned 30. So this would have been the year that Ezekiel would start serving as a priest in the temple, but he wasn't in Jerusalem and he wasn't in the temple. He was on the banks of the Kidron River. Ezekiel was about to receive a call from God to become a prophet instead of a priest, and he would embark on a ministry that he would pursue the rest of his life. While he was near the Kidron River, Ezekiel said the heavens opened up and he saw a vision of God. From a windstorm coming out of the north came an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. And it's important that this vision came out of the north, because that's not the direction Israel was. Israel was from the south. So God wasn't coming from Israel. As the vision continued, 4 living creatures emerged from the cloud. We are told in Ezekiel chapter 10 that they are cherubim, which is derived from a term meaning great or mighty. The cherubim first appear in Genesis chapter 3, and they guard the way, where they guarded the way to the tree of life after Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden. And they appear several other places throughout the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. The 4 creatures that Ezekiel saw were probably the same 4 living creatures that John talks about in chapter 4 of the book of Revelation. In both Ezekiel's and John's vision, the cherubim surround the throne of God. John says the first creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third was like a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle. Ezekiel says something very similar. He says that each of the 4 creatures he saw had 4 faces: a human being, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. For Ezekiel, the man, the lion, the ox, and the eagle may have been symbols of God's dominion. And this is an important point. The man for human beings, the lion for wild animals, the ox for domestic animals, and the eagle for flying birds. In other words, dominion over everything. And after John's vision in Revelation, these creatures would later become symbolic of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, the man, Mark, the lion, Luke, the ox, and John, the eagle. Although I'm not sure that everyone assigns these 4 symbols to the Gospels in the same way. It was commentators in the early years after the Bible was written, and they would say it different ways. That was more or less a consensus. Ezekiel's cherubim had 4 wings, and they could move in any direction without turning. Beside these living creatures were 4 directional wheels that looked like wheels intersecting wheels in a perpendicular direction. Like the creatures themselves, they could move in different directions without turning. The 4 faces of the intersecting wheels were probably symbolic of the 4 basic directions and of the mobility of God. This is another important point. God not only ruled everything, God was everywhere. He could go anywhere he wanted. The Lord ruled all of nature, and he could go wherever he wanted to go. He was not trapped within temple walls. And this was obvious to Ezekiel, since God appeared to him in Babylon by the Kidron River. Now we get to the good part. Ezekiel goes on to describe the throne of God. The Bible says, above the vault, over the heads, was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli. and high above the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant lights surrounded him. His appearance was like a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, and so was the radiance around him. And then a key point: this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Ezekiel's vision was a pivotal point in human history. Through Ezekiel and other messengers, the exiles in Babylon received a new and deeper understanding of God. God was the ruler of the entire world, not just Israel. And he lived everywhere, not just within the Jerusalem temple. When Ezekiel saw God's glory by the Kibar River, his understanding of God expanded. It grew. And through Ezekiel and others like him, the rest of the exiles slowly, not all at once, actually over a long time, slowly but surely began to enlarge their vision of God. You know, the Bible says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, God created the heavens and the earth. But as a practical matter, many Israelites had a much more limited understanding of God before the exile. You know, they didn't have scriptures the way we do now. They weren't as familiar as we are. And they were surrounded by cultures that had very different values. And in that sense, maybe we're somewhat like them. Although the Bible says God created everything, the Israelites thought that there were many gods, which is probably why they had so much problem with idolatry. People worshipped other gods because they thought other gods existed. To them, God was more of a local deity who lived within the temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel helped them enlarge their understanding of God by remembering who Yahweh really was. God's glory could shine anywhere, even in the darkest situations. The psalmist who wrote Psalm 137 did not think God's glory could shine in Babylon. That's one of the reasons he said, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" God's glory was supposed to reside on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant within the Holy of Holies, not beside some pagan river. Israel had put God in a box. And there beside the Kibar River, God started to take that box apart. From the time of Moses, God dwelt with humanity through the tabernacle and later through a temple. It was within the Holy of Holies that people encountered God's glory. And the only high priest did that, and only once a year. Even Isaiah, when he had his vision of God's glory, many years before Ezekiel's time, the Lord was high upon a throne and he was surrounded by seraphim. It's sort of like Ezekiel's vision. But that vision took place within the temple where God's glory was supposed to reside, while Ezekiel's vision took place in Babylon. The temple before the exile, the temple was the heart of Israel's identity. That was where God's presence dwelt among his people. One of the reasons the rulers of Judah refused to believe the prophet Jeremiah when he said that Babylon would conquer Jerusalem was that they could not believe that God would let the place up where his glory resided be desecrated by foreigners. They look back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God made an everlasting promise to King David. In verse 16 of 2 Samuel chapter 7, God says to David, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Of course, that was fulfilled through Christ. But back then, they thought that meant Jerusalem was invulnerable. Some false prophets had used that promise to argue that Jerusalem and its temple could never be overrun. Jeremiah and Ezekiel had told them that they were wrong about that, and for that, Jeremiah and Ezekiel were considered heretics. But the city and its temple did fall. God had indeed made an everlasting covenant with David, but sin still had its consequences. Eventually, Judah was defeated and the temple was destroyed. That did not mean, however, that God's promise to King David had failed. As we learn in Ezekiel chapter 37, God can do anything. He can give life to dry bones. Judah would one day be revived. The nation would live again. The Lord was creator of the whole universe, and he was ruler of the entire world. He was the one and only God, and he would bring his people back from exile in order to rebuild Jerusalem and restore the temple. We can see this enlarged vision of God in Isaiah as well as in Ezekiel, particularly in chapters 40 through 55. God said that he would use the Persians to conquer the Babylonians, and that Cyrus, king of Persia, would allow the children of Israel to return to the promised land. God could do this because he was the one and only God who ruled all the nations. We see these ideas in Isaiah chapter 45. There, God speaks directly to the Persian king Cyrus, and he says, "For the sake of Jacob, my servant, of Israel, my chosen, I have summoned you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, people may know that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and I create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things." Isaiah chapter 45, verses 4 through 7. These chapters of Isaiah promote the same enlarged vision of God that Ezekiel was promoting. Ezekiel was trying to enlarge the people's understanding of God in order to create hope for the future. By the time Cyrus allowed the exiles in Babylon to return to Jerusalem, the people were beginning to see that God was the one and only true God, and that God was even working through pagan kings to accomplish his divine purposes. A passage from Isaiah 43 looks past, no, I said Isaiah. We're studying Ezekiel. A passage from Ezekiel chapter 43 looks past the time of the return from exile to a time when the temple would be rebuilt and the glory of the Lord would return to the holy city. In Ezekiel chapters 40 through 42, the prophet describes the restored temple in great detail. Ezekiel was given a measuring stick, and a man led him on a tour of the new temple. God was showing Ezekiel that everything in the temple had been properly restored prior to God's return. Chapter 11 of the book of Revelation describes a similar scene. John was given a measuring stick and was told to measure the temple prior to Christ's return. In the case of Ezekiel, when he was through measuring the temple, he was taken to the eastern gate of the temple where he saw the glory of the Lord returning to Israel, to Jerusalem. This was the same gate where he had seen God's glory leaving the temple prior to Jerusalem's destruction. You can read about God leaving the temple in Ezekiel chapter 10. As God returned to the city, Ezekiel could hear the sound of rushing waters, and he saw a radiant light. He said it was the same kind of experience he had had at the Kibar River when the Lord first called him to proclaim God's message. And it was also like the vision he had in chapter 10 when God had left Jerusalem. Then the Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and took him to the inner court of the temple. And the Bible says that the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Shortly thereafter, the prophet heard God's voice saying, "Son of man, this is the place where my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever." What God showed Ezekiel was not the temple that was rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah after the fall of Babylon. Instead, God showed the prophet a vision of a restored temple at the end of time. It was a vision of God and man living together eternally. This was how God's promise to David would be fulfilled. God and man would be together forever through Christ. From the moment of his calling at the Kibar River, Ezekiel understood that God was much more than a national deity who lived in the temple of Jerusalem. He was the creator of heaven and earth and the one and only God, and his presence surrounds us wherever we are, in Babylon as well as in Judah. God allowed Babylon to conquer Judah, and the nation's old way of life was gone for good. But God's plan for his people continued. Even in Babylon, they weren't alone. The temple would be rebuilt. Israel's relationship with God would be restored. People's lives would be redeemed. There was hope for the future because God, the God of Israel, was far greater than they had previously imagined. And he was with them. He was the one and only God who had a plan for all mankind. He loved them. As Paul says, if God be for us, who can be against us? Ezekiel saw what God was doing in his time. He was faithful to the vision and true to his calling. Amidst great personal suffering and loss, he continued on, and he helped everyone else continue on. He helped the people of Israel reinterpret their present situation and redefine their purpose. He gave them hope for the future. And in doing so, he changed the world. And that's it. Stop recording.